Hey, APUSH gang. Hope you guys are doing well this evening. Actually, it's the morning where you are. I have been doing a little studying and preparing for our lesson today. You should have already done your short answer question associated with the reading that you just did, or you should have done, and submitted it. So hopefully you've got that behind you. And I'm going to jump into a lesson today and try to wrap up Chapter 17, which is the conclusion of period 6. And so, if I remember correctly, the plan is to finish up the lesson today and then have you guys prepare for your Chapter 17 quiz, which will be on Monday. You should finish your publisher's quiz for Chapter 17. Feel free to use your book. Please don't use online sources. And try to find the answers. It will not benefit you. Just do them yourself. And then also the rest of the period questions should be submitted on Monday as well. So I anticipate that by the time class starts on Monday, you guys will submit your Chapter 17 Publishers Quiz. And you can either, actually just take a picture of it and send it to me. Because I think I gave it to you in a Word document. And then you should submit a Google Doc with your period questions for Chapter 17, and that will finish up your questions for Chapter 17. And then I'll have to figure this out, but we'll have a test over period 6 before we jump into period 7. I have not graded anything from this past week or so, but I did finish grading your test that you took I think right before spring break. It was your period 6 exam, and the scores were kind of all over the place. Some of you are still struggling with reading comprehension. I would say that 5 of the 7 of you had a hard time interpreting the second short answer question, which had to do with 2 historians' views about the Civil War. And I'm actually going to write my own answer and submit it to you so you guys can kind of see the proper interpretation of those passages and so forth. So that will be coming at you. I'm not even sure when. I haven't gotten to it yet. I still have to record my lesson for the other history class. So if you have any questions about your test, feel free to email me or call me. I'd be happy to go over it with you and tell you what you missed. I can't, you guys already have, your parents should have a copy of the test, and so, or I can just tell you which ones you missed and tell you what the correct answer is if you want me to. So anyway, I do have, of course, Captain America has joined us again today. I don't have very much makeup on today. I decided I was going to do the no makeup thing, but I put on some lipstick for y'all. I have no lip color. Guys, I know this doesn't matter to you, but if I don't put lipstick on, I'm invisible. So I had to put some lipstick on for you. So, and also you probably noticed Mr. Obama is gracing as a pin on my shirt. This is to commemorate the fact that former President Obama finally decided to endorse somebody for president. And I know this is going to shock you, but he did not endorse Donald Trump. He opted instead to endorse the Joe Biden, his former vice president. And so we have an official presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. Who knows what the November elections are going to look like? Should be interesting as far as whether or not we're back in the middle of a coronavirus nightmare or I don't know. So anyway, it'll be interesting. So anyway, I have been trying to stay in the loop with the news, although most of the news coverage is just kind of dominated by all of the other stuff. So here we go. We're going to jump into today's lesson. The last lesson we talked about the rise of the Populist Party and their influence in the world. We also talked about the declining situation for Black Americans and all those things that they had hoped for after the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was not coming to pass. In fact, I would say that things were going in the opposite direction, unfortunately, and things are only going to get worse. And it's not just going to get worse for Black Americans, but it's also going to get worse for immigrants, workers, those that are on the low end of the totem pole are going to get squished a little bit more. So unfortunately, so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Uh, there was a portion of your book that I told you not to read, and I'm going to cover that very briefly with you today. And then we're going to dive into what you should have read about imperialism in the world, in America, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So let me move on here. So the section of your book that you did not read was called Redrawing the Boundary Lines. It was on pages 653 to 658. And so I'm just going to kind of summarize that for you. It talked about kind of 4 different people groups in the United States that were experiencing, I would say, restrictions of civil liberties, discrimination, nativism, kind of a rise in elitism, pro-Anglo-Saxon attitudes, anti-Chinese attitudes. Lots of laws were passed during this time, anti-immigrant laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, even acts or laws that were passed to exclude immigration of Japanese to the United States. So a lot of that stuff was going on. So anyway, we're going to take a look at that. All right, let me put my glasses on so I can see what I'm reading. All right, there's a quote in your book on page 653, which is the opening part of that section that you did not read. And basically it summarizes this period of time at the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. And it says, American society seemed to be fracturing along lines of both class and race. And specifically referring to the 1890s. And so I'm going to go through a few of these things. The first thing that this section talks about that you did not read is about a new wave of immigration into this country. In the years before this, most of the immigrants that were coming to this country were from Western Europe, England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, the Swedish countries, Scandinavia, and a lot of their customs, their religions were similar to our ancestors. And so while it wasn't a glorious welcome, it certainly was not as difficult as the new immigrants of the late 1800s were going to receive from Americans. And so new immigrants were primarily from, I would call them Slavic people from Eastern Europe, people that were Russian, Austria-Hungary, but a lot of those Slavic countries. And they were, for the most part, considered by most Americans as second class, downtrodden, uneducated, didn't have proper upbringing, didn't have proper religion. They were dirty. Their customs were strange. Their language was not very attractive, even the way they spoke. And so there was a lot of prejudice towards them and a lot of resistance to allow them to be absorbed into our culture and our way of life. More so than immigrants prior to this time. Laws were established that attempted to restrict their immigration. There was an organization called the Immigration Restriction League, which actually it called for it tried to restrict citizenship rights so that immigrants could not vote, immigrants from that part of the world. They tried to pass an English test as a qualification, a whole bunch of things. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't successful, some of them passed Congress and then got vetoed, but it definitely demonstrated a anti-Eastern immigrant sentiment that was rising in the country. Another people group that suffered significantly during this time were Chinese. Chinese that already lived here, especially primarily out in California and the West Coast, were suffering lots of discriminatory policies towards them. Their children were not allowed to attend schools at all, let alone segregated schools. There was sort of this attitude that Americans could tolerate pretty much anything but Chinese. And there is some truth to the fact that American workers were a little bit threatened by the labor force. But I think more than anything, it was just the fact that they physically looked different. They were easy to spot, to identify. Their customs were completely different than our customs. There wasn't a lot of understanding about their way of life. The Asian peoples had lived pretty cocooned and separated from the West of Western civilization. So we didn't know a lot about them. Of course, again, their religion was different. John Green says in one of his videos that we were uncomfortable with their hygiene habits in that they bathed frequently. And that seemed strange to us that they would bathe all of the time. And I'm thinking that's a good thing. And so laws were actually passed to prohibit them from coming in. Initially, the railroads consumed Chinese laborers because they could pay them cheap and they would do pretty much anything. But when Chinese families began to immigrate to this country, people became very concerned. It was one thing to have a man come and work here and then send money home and eventually go back to China. It was something completely different to have an entire different race group of people come into our country and establish their home here. And so laws were passed to prohibit Chinese from moving here, their wives from moving here, their families from moving here. There were laws that were passed to prevent them from becoming citizens. Everybody was trying to figure out exactly what the 14th Amendment applied to. Obviously, the 14th Amendment was written specifically to define citizenship for Black Americans, but did that mean that other people here that came here also potentially had the right of citizenship? Did that law apply to Chinese? And so laws were passed to try to restrict that. One of those was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was passed, I think, in 1882, and it was in place in some forms or fashions all the way until the end of World War II. So it existed for a very long time. Eventually, the Supreme Court began to rule sort of in favor of the Chinese when they would file suit and use our legal system. For instance, in California, Chinese were not allowed to go to school at all, and the Supreme Court ruled, well, they for the children that were born here, they effectively are they didn't call them naturalized citizens. That was a question that was up for debate, but effectively they were, and they couldn't prohibit giving them an education as the law of California required that the state educate their populace. So eventually what they determined was that they would provide schools for Chinese children that were born in America, but they were segregated schools. For a very long time, again, up until I think the 1940s, Chinese Americans were not allowed to be buried in the cemeteries with white Americans, which again is just crazy to me. That's not that long ago. And so Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants faced lots and lots and lots of persecution, pretty much across the board. The next slide, there's a continuing conversation within the section that you did not read about attitudes and how they were changing during this time. So definitely nativism was on the rise, anti-immigration was on the rise, pro-Anglo-Saxon, the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon people, kind of elitism is the word the book uses. And then it kind of shifts gears a little bit and talks about, okay, so if that's the way things are going to be, what's our new normal look like as Americans, as Black Americans, as women, as workers, if the American people are becoming more stringent and more discriminatory and our laws are supporting those attitudes? How do we bloom where we're planted, basically? How do my PowerPoint says, how do we make lemonade out of lemons? That old expression. So the book introduces a person named Booker T. Washington, and he was probably the most famous Black American of his era. He had been born a slave, and I think he was born in the 1850s, so he didn't live in that condition for very long. Became very educated, ultimately became the president of the Tuskegee Institute, extremely articulate, powerful brain. And he decided, and I believe he was a Christian as well, he decided that he was not going to fight the civil rights fight anymore, that the handwriting was on the wall, and during the course of his lifetime, he probably was not going to see white Americans' hearts changed as a whole, and the law as a whole change in such a way that would honor Black Americans' rights, civil rights under the Constitution. And so he said, well, if I can't beat them, I'm going to join them. And he decided that the best hope for Black Americans during his lifetime was not to fight the civil rights fight, but instead to fight the economic fight and the education fight. And so he began a campaign. He traveled around the country. He started it at I think a cotton exposition in Atlanta. Cotton Expo, and he gave a powerful speech, and he said it's time to ante up and start making our way in this world and taking advantage of those things that we do have at our disposal, and stop worrying about the things we can't control as a black community. And so he encouraged black Americans to educate their children, even if it was in segregated schools, to fight to give them higher education, to try to get better jobs, to get skilled jobs, to go to he encouraged the development of schools that promoted that were for black people only, because the white schools were off limits to them. The Tuskegee Institute trained pilots, it trained doctors, whole host of things. There's a famous crew called the Tuskegee Airmen that were famous war heroes. And so anyway, that was his focus, and he was very, very successful during that time. So you saw a great improvement of the increase of the middle class, black American middle class, and education improved for black Americans. Opportunities improved. He found himself in the company of the movers and shakers of the world, the Andrew Carnegies, the presidents. Teddy Roosevelt had him to the White House on a number of occasions. President Taft. And he seemed to be the voice of reason. There was another gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was took a different position than him. He's a little bit younger than Booker T. Washington, so he kind of comes up on the tail end, and we'll talk about him in another chapter. But he felt that Booker T. Washington was selling out, was giving up, and that was not what black Americans were called to do. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is a video that I want you to watch. It's only like 3.5 minutes long, that discusses the lifetime of Booker T. Washington and his contributions. I have a beautiful picture of him. You can't tell how beautiful it is in this picture because of the pixels, but I have a high quality image of him that's very similar to the one in your PowerPoint. It's almost like he's sitting in the room with us. It's such a clear, crisp picture. I think he would have been a wonderfully interesting man to have a conversation with. So I do want you to watch that video, and you'll see the prompt in the PowerPoint when you should watch that. Another element of society that decided to make lemonade out of lemons was America's workers, those that worked in the industrial factories. They spent decades fighting big business, fighting the government for rights and for better working conditions, and fighting the whole idea of freedom of contract, and how the courts always ruled against them. The presidents tended to send in federal troops when they exercised their right to strike. And so finally, they decided to shift gears and say, well, again, if we can't beat them, let's join them. Let's use this idea of freedom of contract against the employer. So if you remember, the freedom of contract, that was the dominant idea, legal standing of this era, said that ultimate freedom is when an employee and an employer work out the arrangement of their employment together for the best of both parties. Now, obviously, in this era, employers were taking advantage of their workers. They were underpaying them. They were overworking them. They were preventing them from striking. And the courts tended to rule with the employers. So during this era, as new labor unions began to form and have a different idea, they said, you know what, we're not going to worry about this legal fight anymore. The courts are going to keep ruling in favor of the employers. Instead, let's take our skilled workers, kind of the middle class of the working force, and let's try to get the best circumstances and the best working conditions for them, and not be so militant and legal in the way that we go about it. The organization that the book talks about is the American Federation of Labor, AFL. Today it's still a very active labor union. Oftentimes it's this AFL-CIO. Samuel Gompers, his name is on the PowerPoint. He is a very, very famous leader of the American Federation of Labor. He was the president of the union. And he was the one who championed this idea that they were going to make freedom of contract work for the workers, rather than always giving it over to the employers and the government to use it as a tool against them. Another group that the book talks about continuing in a struggle was the women's suffrage movement, the women's temperance movement, We Are Women movement. The section is called The Women's Era. And unfortunately, this movement, the suffragette movement, that morphed out of the abolitionist movement, which champion the right of black people to be free, ultimately to have right of citizenship, the right to vote. What used to support that was now giving up and sort of joining this elitist idea that Anglo-Saxon women were the ones that should ultimately have the right to vote, that Anglo-Saxon women are the ones that should be educated. And actually by 1890, 1900, you had a generation of women that were college educated. There were women's colleges that were opening up. So there was an opportunity for women to advance themselves. The book says that women had finally won in court the right to property, the right to their own salaries, different rights related to marriage and license and contracts, where in the past they were considered essentially the property of their husbands. And so they had made some advancements, and with that they had kind of absorbed this elitist attitude. I think there was also a fear that we need to focus and concentrate our efforts on ourselves, rather than these immigrant women that are coming from Eastern Europe that are ignorant and uneducated and weird. And I don't believe that, but that was sort of the prevailing attitude. And so they morphed their former abolitionist roots and became sort of this elitist group that adhered to some of these racist, discriminatory attitudes of the era. And so they wanted liberty in the form of exercising the right to vote for themselves, but they did not want to extend that to people who they felt that were not as good as them. And so so that whole section is kind of what that revolved, or those topics it revolved around. All right, so I'm going to move into the section that you should have read. I'm looking at the clock. I'm in 20 minutes here. Okay, I'm going to do this pretty quickly since hopefully you've read this. Becoming a World Power and Imperialism. This is found on pages 659 through 673 loosely. You'll notice on your PowerPoint that there is a picture of the world empires in 1900. The book talks a little bit about the fact that Africa was carved up into little countries. I can't remember what year it was. Late 1800s, 1898, maybe 1899, 1900. There was a convention in Berlin where all of the European powers literally got the map out and said, okay, which part of Africa do you want? Which part of Africa do you want? And Africa became a colonial continent. And America, I think, felt like, when do we get a piece of the pie? And, I would say that it was not consensus at this point that America was going to be an imperialist power. But forces came to play upon the situation that pulled America into a war, the Spanish-American War, which landed them colonial territories. And all of a sudden, the justification of taking over lands and other territories became too much to bear. And Americans gave in. So, I'm going to read from my PowerPoint. There's a little picture of Uncle Sam here. It says, American imperialism from the years 1890 to 1913, give or take. American imperialism is the economic, military, and cultural influence of the United States on other countries, hand in hand with the expansion into foreign territories. There was a desire for military strength during this era. As I think it was Admiral, forgot his name, Hannah, maybe. He encouraged the presidents in the late 1800s to build a military. Teddy Roosevelt's going to take that and run with it. But President McKinley to build a navy. And so there was a thirst to raise our abilities and powers and military strength on the waters to compete with those European countries that were already doing that. There was a need for new markets to sell our goods in. America was... I think it started in 1893, going through a significant depression, and the thought that we could find other markets to sell our goods to was another reason to expand our empire, our territory. And then there, again, as I said before, there was just sort of this idea that our culture was superior to other cultures in the world. Sometimes I think it was President McKinley talked about some of these conquered territories as the little brown people. Ouch! Can you imagine if a president said that today? And so I'm going to kind of just walk with you slowly here the various territories that America began to consume outside of the continental United States um, before the Spanish-American War. So in 1867, right after the Civil War, Secretary of State Seward, who was involved in the assassination attempt, or he was actually injured, he was one of the targets of Lincoln's assassins, he survived, thought it would be a good idea for America to acquire Alaska. Russia had previously tried to colonize parts of California and then up into Alaska, and I think it's the Aleutian Islands, which are connected to Russia. They kind of cross over with some of the Alaskan islands. He eyeballed those for potentially a Pacific fleet. Thought it would be a good place to have a kind of a resting station for our fleet, and so he asked Congress to purchase Alaska. Some people called it Seward's Icebox. Some people refer to it as Seward's Folly. Who wants Alaska? But they agreed to it. They paid $7.2 million to Russia for Alaska. And it's a good thing. Paid off all of the oil that was discovered in Alaska in later years. And, of course, for national security reason. And so 1867 was kind of that first outside of the continental United States. In 1898, Hawaii became a U.S. territory. It's kind of a long and sordid story, but Queen Luluakalani was deposed by the United States Marines when it was suggested that she was going to prevent an election or a vote on whether or not to become a U.S. territory. Hawaii was populated by a number of American citizens. Businessmen had gone there to make money in the sugarcane and pineapple businesses, and eventually there were more Americans and internationals living there than were actually local populations, and it became very alarming to Queen Luluakalani, and so she decided she was not going to allow a vote or something along those lines. And so the president sent the U.S. Marines in there to depose her. The book says that when President Clinton was president, he issued a formal apology to the people of Hawaii for taking their country away from them. So it was also an attempt to prevent import taxes on the sugar that was produced there. So in 1898, Hawaii became a state. And then the Spanish-American War. So don't get confused with the Mexican-American War. The Spanish-American War was actually against the Spanish. The Spanish had colonial holdings all around the world. And one of them was in our very backyard, the island country of Cuba. It's always a thorn in the side. And the Spanish treated the Cuban people horribly. And when there were independence movements, the Spanish people would come in there and squash them, and it was under the eye of the American people, many whose relatives lived in Cuba, and so those voices of independence came to America and used the press and drew attention to the situation in Cuba. The American people got behind the people of Cuba and wanted them to have their independence from the Spanish people. At the same time, there's a picture. Some pictures that show up on the screen that are a little bit disturbing. Some of them are actual photographs, and then the other side is actually drawings that are, somebody just let my dog in, some drawings. Come here, Romeo. You want to see? Come here. Hold on a second. Come here. Here we go. Come here. Don't bark at me. I'm going to let everybody see you. Here he is. All right, he's going to sit here with me for a minute. So, yellow journalism was being practiced during this era. This is sensationalizing printing, news, reporting. And as more and more newspapers and magazines were practicing yellow journalism, there was a lot of money in it. More people would buy those newspapers if the stories were a little, there you go, the stories were a little bit crazy. The politicians decided to send journalists to Cuba to inform the American people what was actually happening there. And there were a lot of atrocities there. There were actually internment camps, sometimes referred to as concentration camps, for those that were fighting for independence, and the Spanish would treat them horribly. The pictures that you see here are mostly of children. Looks like there's one of a mom, and it just shows the conditions on the ground in Cuba. People were starving to death. People in those internment camps were were dying, were being treated horrible, and then those pictures were then published in the newspapers, which really rallied American sympathies towards the Cuban people. Causes of the Spanish-American War. Obviously, Cuba is only 90 miles away from the southern tip of Florida and the Florida Key Islands, and so it was in our backyard. Sympathy for the Cuban people. We've always been sympathetic toward the cause of freedom and self-rule, and so that came into play. Let's see here. Yellow journalism, sensational stories, Joseph Pulitzer, and I can't remember the other guy's name. I think he's in here. And then ultimately, the final straw, after several months of reporting on the terrible conditions down in Cuba, President McKinley was encouraged to send a U.S. naval ship to Cuba to either evacuate American businessmen and citizens that were operating in Cuba and the conditions were getting really, really terrible, or also possibly to prep for a future encounter with the Spanish. And so while the USS Maine was in I think they were in the Havana Harbor, something terrible happened, probably an accident. They think there might have been a fire in a boiler room, but at the time it was reported by the papers in the United States that the USS Maine had exploded. It had killed 260 American naval soldiers, and that the Spanish were to blame because they had intentionally put mines in the water and had caused an explosion. It was an act of war. Americans were furious. Remember the Maine became the call, like remember the Alamo. The newspapers were, remember the Maine, remember the Maine. They were printing all of these salacious stories that were probably completely baseless, and the Spanish really didn't, what are they going to do? And so I included in the PowerPoint some pictures of some of the newspaper clippings. The spirit of war pervades the breasts of all American. Patriotic citizens advocate recourse to arms to wreak vengeance upon the Spanish and their cruelty. Remember the Maine. And so I do believe that when you guys were in Washington, D.C., when you were touring Arlington National Cemetery, I believe your tour guide pointed out the mast of the USS Maine that was retrieved from Havana Harbor and is now located in Arlington National Cemetery at the very top of the hill. And there is a memorial there inscribed on the mast. It's a foundation that the mast of the ship is sitting in, and there are some pictures there at Arlington National Cemetery. It says, erected in memory of the officers and men who lost their lives in the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on the 15th of February, 1898. And it's got the name of all the men who died on that boat. And so the war begins. President McKinley gives in to the pressure, thinks it might be good for patriotism, coming out of the Depression, a cause for Americans to get behind. And so he asked Congress to declare war. They did. They declared war on Spain. And everybody thought the battle would begin in Cuba. And interestingly enough, it did not. It was kind of a sly move. We had a fleet of ships in Hong Kong, sitting off of the city of Hong Kong, and we sent them down to the Philippines, which was another group of islands, a large country of islands that the Spanish control. There's a map on the PowerPoint that shows you where the Philippines are. When you had me in geography, we labeled it on the map. But that is where the battle started, and it didn't take very long to quickly defeat the Spanish Navy in the Philippines. So, chronological events of the war. On April 20th, 1898, Congress declares war on Spain. The war starts in the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey destroys every Spanish ship within just hours. By August, so just a few months later, in 1898, Spanish forces surrender. There was fighting, obviously, as well on the island of Cuba. Probably the most famous battles was the Battle of San Juan Hill, which future President Teddy Roosevelt was involved in. He was serving at the time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned his post. He was almost 40 years old. He raised up a volunteer group of cavalry. They headed down to Cuba to liberate the people of Cuba from the evil Spanish colonial empire. That's kind of put him on the map. After the war, he went back to New York. He was elected governor, and then just 1 year later, President McKinley asked him to run as his vice presidential candidate in his second reelection, his reelection or second election bid. We also, prior to the San Juan Hill battle, were involved in a naval blockade of the islands of Cuba. And let's see, I think the book says that there was only 400 Americans that lost their lives in battle during the Spanish-American War, and it only lasted about 4 months. Another Spanish holding, Puerto Rico, was captured in July of 1989. So Philippines, and then June of 1898, Cuba was taken. In July of 1898, Puerto Rico was taken. And then August 12th, 1898 was a ceasefire. There's a darling picture of Mr. Roosevelt with the Rough Riders atop of San Juan Hill. Very classic picture. And then the Treaty of Paris, another Treaty of Paris, was signed in December of 1898. The terms of the end of the war. Cuba was given its freedom with some strings attached. But if the war was fought for the liberty of Cuba, certainly we were not going to acquire it as a territory. However, we did get the agreement to keep troops on the island and keep the island, if there were any problems, that we could intervene. The Platt Amendment, got to know that, the Platt Amendment was part of the Cuban Constitution, and it gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba if there were any problems. And it also provided the opportunity, or it required Cuba to allow us to have a naval base on Cuba. That naval base is still there today. It is the very famous Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where we keep enemy combatants, primarily from the War on Terror. When they are captured on the battlefield, we take them to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and that naval base still exists. In the Treaty of Paris of 1898, we acquired Guam from the Spanish, which is in the Pacific Islands. We acquired the Philippines. We paid the Spanish $20 million for it, but we did acquire the Philippines. And then we also acquired Puerto Rico and some of the West Indies and the Caribbean. There is a picture here of Vice President Mike Pence with on the island of Guam with Air Force One in the background, or I guess it's Air Force Two when he's flying on it. The citizens of Guam have a special relationship with the United States, and I don't know if they have citizenship rights. I think if they join the U.S. military, I think they have the right to become citizens, and so there's a U.S. naval base there, and a number of the men of Guam, women of Guam as well, but mostly men, serve in the U.S. military. And there's a cool picture there. Several cartoons on the PowerPoint that kind of show America's imperialist nature at this time, with President McKinley and Uncle Sam and carving up all of these various territories. Of course, there was a considerable controversy about whether or not the ideals of liberty and democracy and self-governing were compatible with territory garnering. I mean, do we have the moral superior or high road? What we believe in, is that compatible with taking other people's land from them and making them territories? And of course, it was defended by, of course we do. We are extending Christianity to them. We are extending our culture, our superior culture to them. We're connecting them to a financial resource. We can take care of them. It's a little bit reminiscent of that idea of maternalism, what's the word we used, with slaves, paternal ethos, that this is for their good, that we're doing this. Never mind that we aren't giving them the right of citizenship or the right to participate in our political process. So lots of controversy there. One of the other ironies of the era is that while we were refusing Chinese immigration to our country, we were requiring the Chinese to trade with us. The European powers had carved up zones in China for trading and markets, and we said, hey, we want to be involved. And so Secretary of State John Hay, who was William McKinley's Secretary of State, formulated something called the open door policy. Essentially what he did was he went to China and he involved European world leaders and said, you don't get all of China. We get to be involved in this as well. He basically insisted on it or threatened war. We had, essentially been building up our navy. Europeans didn't want to go to war with us. The Chinese certainly were in no situation to go to war with us, or we didn't think they were. And so everybody said, okay. So the open door policy was towards China, and it forced China and the rest of European players to permit America a slice of the pie in China, essentially those markets for our goods. And the way the book describes it is that the open door policy was a movement of goods and money, but not of Chinese people. We didn't want Chinese people. In response to all of this influence in China, nationalists in China, known as the Boxers, decided to rebel against this, and in an organized effort, they rose up in rebellion, and in traditional format, they essentially went across the certain territories of China and began to slaughter those people that were associated with Western values, in particular Christians. And so Chinese Christians were slaughtered. I don't remember for sure, but I would assume that there were probably Europeans that were caught up in that slaughter. America did respond and send troops there, and the Boxer Rebellion was squashed, and the Chinese markets remained open. That took place in 1900. And then sadly, kind of the last thing I'm going to touch on here is that the most unfamiliar, forgotten war of the era was the Philippine-American War. And it happened because when we acquired the Philippines as a result of our defeat of the Spanish Empire, the Philippine people, who had been wanting independence from the Spanish, believed that America would give them their independence because of our history with colonialism and our fight against the British. And they were quite shocked when America said, no, you need us. You are an uncivilized people. You're not prepared to self-rule. We're going to come in there and we're going to set up highways and byways and schools and our way of doing things. We're going to Christianize you. As the book says, of course, the irony is that the Spanish were Catholic. And they were like, well, we're already Christian. I don't understand what you mean. We're not Muslim, we're not Buddhist, we're not any of that. We've been practicing Catholicism for 400 years. And so many of the leaders of the Philippines were extremely upset, and they began an organized resistance to America's land grab. The most famous of those leaders was Emilio Aguinaldo. He believed America was with him and discovered they were not with him. I think he actually helped them defeat the Spanish, and so he organized a fight for independence that became extremely bloody. The book says that Americans mishandled their occupation. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. There were accusations of inappropriate engagements by American soldiers, that they killed civilians, raped civilians. I don't know if it was part of yellow journalism, if it was actually true, but there was widespread rumors that that was the case. Thousands and thousands of Filipinos died. Many, many more Americans died in the Filipino-American War, which was a direct result of the Spanish-American War, where there was very little loss of blood, loss of life. The book says, I don't know if it was in the book, but I found this independently, but 70,000 American troops were sent to the Philippines over the course of the time that they were trying to squash this revolt. It took place about 2.5 years. 4,000 Americans died compared to the 400 from the initial war. Now, a lot of those died as a result of malaria and other things happening over there, but nonetheless, they died as a direct result of this conflict. 20,000 Filipino rebels died, so it was awful. It says that America spent $400 million to put down this rebellion, to acquire a territory that just simply wanted independence. America held on to the Philippines and slowly gave them self-rule leading up to World War II. There's a famous World War II general named General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, that was stationed on the Philippines when the Japanese tried to take over the islands at the beginning of the war. He was evacuated against his will by President Roosevelt. He was going to stay and fight to the end, and he was evacuated in the middle of the night in this kind of secret operation, and he said, I will be back. And he was true to his word. At the end of World War II, he came back, and eventually, I think, I don't know if I have the date here, I don't think I do. I think the Philippines garnered their independence like in 1953, something along those lines, and so they've been an independent country since that time. All right, there's some pictures here of the Filipino-American War, Americans in trenches, and some of the natives fighting with the Americans. There's actually a lot of photographs of that war. And then the last slide is the new American empire, and I'm just going to read it. Two principles central to American freedom came in conflict during this era of empire building. No longer were the people who were under our control, did they have any representation for the taxes that they were going to be forced to pay through trade and whatnot. And they were not they were not allowed to consent to those who governed over them. So no taxation without representation, and government based upon the consent of the governed were two foundational principles of American history that were thrown out with the bathwater, the baby in the bathwater, during this time. The new American empire gave way to imperialism and the belief that the domination of non-white peoples by whites formed part of the progress of civilization. It was a justification that we have a more superior culture and we want to share that with you, and we're going to do it by force otherwise. And then there were a number of cases that came to the Supreme Court during this era called the Insular cases, and it was an attempt to define what rights do these people in our territories actually have. And the Supreme Court ruled over and over again that constitutional rights do not apply to acquired territories. So essentially the people that live there are not protected by our Constitution. They are American, they are subject to our laws, but they are not protected by our laws. And that was a really hypocritical place to be in a weird time in history. It did not last very long. With the coming of World War I, which is just right around the corner, America reversed course and instead became the liberators and then retreated back into isolationism. In fact, the whole era of imperialism and colonial rule is going to blow up with World War I and World War II. And so I'm going to leave it there. I could say a whole lot more, but you're probably tired of listening to me. I already talked for almost 45 minutes. So just let me know if you have any questions. I will continue grading your stuff from my end, but get that publisher's quiz done and get the rest of your period questions done, submitted by Monday morning. And then if you have any questions, let me know. I would strongly suggest that you watch John Green's video on imperialism, and I'm going to include the link in the daily log. So you'll watch Booker T. Washington and the John Green, the era of imperialism. It's really, really good. And that will be our lesson for today. I don't think it'll take you the full 90 minutes. I think you'll be done in about an hour. So see you guys. Bye.